Prison food reality. The dirty truth about the menu. The rotten discovery. Picture this. A tray slides under a cell door. The inmate picks it up, but something feels off. The mashed potatoes smell sour. The meat is gray, slimy. But it's not until he digs deeper that he sees it. Moving, a cockroach wriggling right inside the food. Inmates shout, bang on doors, rage boiling over the cell block. Guards shrug it off. Eat it or starve. This wasn't an accident. This was a daily menu, cheap, dirty, and often dangerous. A system designed not to feed, but to control. But how did things get this bad? And why is prison food often described as worse than slop-fed animals? We're going back to where it began. The menu nobody talks about. Most people think prison food is just bad. Cold beans, stale bread, maybe watered-down juice. But the reality runs deeper. Filthy kitchens, spoiled supplies, and contracts where private companies cut corners for profit. In some prisons, food is bought in bulk from the cheapest suppliers possible. Meat rejected by grocery stores, vegetables long past expiration. By the time it hits the trays, the smell is sour, the taste unbearable. Inmates report mold on bread, maggots in rice, and mystery meat so questionable they call it roadkill stew. Guards know it, staff know it, but the system doesn't care. Why? Because food isn't just food, it's power. Hungry men are easier to control. Meals become a weapon, not a right. For the lucky ones, they choke it down. For the unlucky ones, it leads to sickness, riots, and sometimes worse. And in one notorious case, things spiraled out of control, ending in a shocking discovery that exposed just how dirty the prison menu really is. The next chapter begins with that moment, when hunger turns violent. It started small. A few inmates refused to take their trays. They slid them back out under the bars, untouched. Word spread across the tier. By the next day, dozens were refusing to eat. The kitchen tried to fix the problem by pouring gravy over spoiled meat to hide the smell. But that only made the inmates angrier. One night in the chow hall, the tension finally snapped. An inmate threw his tray onto the floor, shouting, "This ain't food, it's poison." The crash echoed through the room. In seconds, trays flew across the hall like weapons, beans and rice splattering across walls and guards' uniforms. Officers rushed in with batons. Alarms blared. Inmates jumped on tables, screaming, some grabbing metal forks and swinging wildly. What started as a food protest exploded into a full-scale riot. And when the smoke cleared, one thing was found in the kitchen storage that shocked even the guards. The storage room secret. After the riot, guards stormed the kitchen. They wanted proof that inmates were exaggerating. What they found, instead, silenced the room. In the storage area, crates of meat sat unrefrigerated, slimy and green. Bags of rice crawling with bugs. And worse, a bucket of moldy soup still being stirred by kitchen staff, scheduled to be served the next morning. One officer gagged at the smell. Another muttered, "This ain't even legal." But for the inmates, the discovery meant more than spoiled food. It confirmed what they had been saying for months. The menu wasn't broken by accident. It was broken by design. The kitchen staff were under orders. Cut costs, use the cheapest supplies, and keep the meals just barely edible. That night, the news of the discovery spread across the prison tiers. The men felt vindicated, but their hunger turned to rage. If the food was this bad, what else were they being lied to about? The protest wasn't over. In fact, what happened next would push the prison into lockdown. Lockdown over slop. The warden couldn't risk another riot. By dawn, he ordered a full lockdown. No yard, no visits, no movement. Officers stormed cell blocks, slamming doors, shouting, "Lock it down." The message was clear. Complain about the food, and you'll lose everything else. For a moment, the prison went quiet. Some inmates gave in, eating the slop just to survive, but others refused. The hunger strike grew. Dozens of men lay weak on their bunks, refusing every tray that came through the slot. The warden thought he could wait them out, but he didn't count on what happened next. In one of the isolation wings, a guard opened a meal slot to shove in a tray. The inmate inside didn't take it. Instead, He hurled the tray back out, splattering rotten beans across the officer's uniform. Enraged, the guard reached in, and the inmate slashed his arm with a sharpened piece of metal hidden under the bed. Blood sprayed across the concrete. Sirens blared again. The food protest had now turned into open war between staff and prisoners. And in the middle of this chaos, a shocking piece of evidence would soon leak out of prison. Proof of what inmates were really being fed. The evidence leaks out. The prison thought it could keep everything hidden behind the walls. But one kitchen worker, a low-level inmate on food duty, smuggled out what no one expected. Photographs. On a smuggled phone, he snapped shots of the kitchen. Bread with thick green mold, bags of meat crawling with maggots, rats running across open sacks of flour. One photo showed a pan of stew, cloudy and gray, with what looked like a dead mouse floating in the liquid. Those photos made it out, first to families, then to lawyers, then to the local news. Within days, the pictures hit the evening broadcasts. Anchors described it as unfit for animals, let alone humans. The public was outraged. Protests sparked outside the prison gates. Families demanded answers. Politicians promised investigations. Inside, though, the crackdown only got worse. Guards raided cells, searching for phones, punishing entire tiers with meal denial. Some inmates didn't eat for days. And then one morning, when trays finally arrived, something was on the menu that pushed the men over the edge. A dish so foul it ignited the deadliest food riot in the prison's history. The riot over meat surprise. It was breakfast time. Trays slid into cells one by one. The menu? Something the prison called meat surprise. But this time, the surprise was too much. The meat was gray, rubbery, and stank of chemicals. Some inmates swore it was dog food, repackaged and dumped onto their trays. Others said it smelled like ammonia, as if it had been washed to cover rot. One inmate took a single bite and vomited across his bunk. Another lifted a chunk of the meat and found a strip of plastic melted inside. That was the breaking point. By noon, word spread across the tiers. Don't eat it. Flip the hall. In the chow hall, hundreds of men banged trays against tables, the sound echoing like war drums. Then, as if on cue, they hurled the trays into the air. Food splattered across walls, ceilings, even guard shields. Fists flew. Forks turned into weapons. Guards swung batons. The air filled with the stink of rotting food and the roar of rage. The prison went into full-blown riot mode. Tear gas, riot shields, dogs. But through the smoke and chaos, one question burned in everyone's mind. What exactly was in that meat surprise, and who allowed it to be served? The desperate act. The cell block was tense. Radios buzzed with news reports about the food supplier. Inmates sat on bunks, seething, waiting. Guards marched heavier than usual, batons clanging against their belts. Then came lunch. The same trays, the same stench, the same gray meat. One inmate, already weak from refusing meals, snapped. He hurled his tray against the wall, the splatter dripping down like paint. But this time, he didn't stop there. He grabbed a hidden shank, carved from a toothbrush, and lunged at a guard delivering food. Chaos erupted. Screams, alarms, bodies colliding against steel. The guard went down clutching his side, blood pooling across the concrete. The tier exploded. Some inmates joined in, banging doors, shouting for justice. Others froze, terrified. Officers stormed in, pepper spray and shields filling the air with burning chemicals. When it was over, the inmate was dragged out, coughing, beaten, chained at the wrists and ankles. His message was clear. We'd rather die fighting than eat poison. But that act set off a chain reaction no one saw coming. Because just days later, the prison would face an outside investigation that uncovered truth far worse than anyone inside had imagined. The investigators step in. The riot forced the prison's hand. With blood spilled and national headlines swirling, outside investigators were finally allowed in. Health inspectors, state officials, even reporters crowded through the gates. They walked the kitchens, clipboards in hand. What they saw matched the leaked photos. Filthy counters, roaches running across cutting boards, boxes of meat dripping a foul liquid onto the floor. One inspector opened a fridge and immediately gagged. The thermometer inside was broken. Meat stored at unsafe temperatures for weeks. Another noted bags of powdered eggs stamped with expiration dates 2 years old. But then came the real bombshell. Records showed the prison wasn't just serving expired food. It was reusing rejected scraps. Leftovers from trays scraped back into buckets, reheated, and served again the next day. To the public, this was shocking. To the inmates, it was confirmation of their worst fears. They weren't just being fed garbage. They were being recycled like garbage. The scandal should have brought change. But instead, the prison doubled down on security. And soon, another incident would make it clear. Food wasn't just rotten here. It was being used as punishment. Food as a weapon. After the investigation, most people expected reforms. Better kitchens, safer meals, new suppliers. But inside the walls, something darker happened instead. The warden had a new policy: complain and you'll starve. Meals were no longer about nutrition. They were a tool of control. Inmates who caused trouble were given something called the loaf. It wasn't bread. It was a brick of blended leftovers, beans, cabbage, meat, and powder mashed together into a tasteless block. Served cold, 3 times a day. No variety. No seasoning. Just a loaf. Some called it edible punishment. Others said it was cruelty disguised as food. One inmate described it like chewing on wet cardboard with grease. Another swore he lost 15 pounds in a month. But the loaf didn't break everyone. For some, it lit the fire of defiance. In one wing, an inmate snapped after being put on the loaf for weeks straight. He used his last tray, rock hard and brick-like, not to eat but as a weapon. He hurled it at a guard's face, shattering his nose and igniting yet another lockdown. And this time, the violence spread faster than ever before. The chain reaction. The tray attack was like a spark in dry grass. Within minutes, the fire spread. Cell doors rattled as inmates banged fists and metal cups, chanting, "No more loaf! No more loaf!" The noise rolled down the tiers like thunder. Guards scrambled, radios crackling with panic. In one block, inmates shoved mattresses against their doors, setting them on fire with smuggled matches. Black smoke poured into the hallway. In another, men flooded their cells by clogging toilets, water rushing ankle-deep across the concrete. The riot team charged in, shields up, swinging batons, firing pepper balls into the chaos. But the more they hit, the louder the inmates roared. Amid the smoke and chaos, one prisoner climbed onto a table, holding something above his head. It wasn't a weapon. It was a loaf, burnt black around the edges. He shouted, "This is what they feed us." The cameras of guards' body armor caught it all. That footage would later leak out, shocking the public once again. But inside, the prison's response was brutal. Dozens of inmates were dragged into solitary, and what they were served in those tiny cells made the dirty menu even worse. The solitary menu. Solitary confinement was supposed to be punishment enough. 4 walls, 1 bed, and silence. But in this prison, the real punishment came on a tray. Inmates pulled their meals through the slot and found portions so small they barely filled a palm. Cold rice, a slice of bread, maybe a spoonful of beans. Sometimes the food was frozen solid. Other times it was watery mush scraped from the bottom of a pot. One man reported opening his tray to find a sandwich crawling with tiny bugs. Another swore his milk was chunky, sour, and months past expiration. But there was worse. In some solitary units, the guards served nothing but disciplinary loaf for weeks. No vegetables, no fruit, no variety. Just a brick. Again and again. Starving men grew weaker, some hallucinating, some collapsing. Medical staff begged the administration to stop, but the warden's answer was the same. If they want better food, they should have stayed out of trouble. It was more than punishment. It was slow destruction. And then one night, an inmate in solitary made a decision that shocked the entire prison. He refused the tray completely, then collapsed on the floor. By morning, he was dead. That death didn't just stay inside the walls. It set off a storm outside that the prison couldn't contain. Death on the tray. News of the inmate's death spread fast. Official reports claimed it was medical complications, But whispers from inside told a different story. Starvation, malnutrition, and the loaf. Families demanded answers. Outside the prison, protesters gathered with signs reading, "Humans deserve food," and "Stop feeding them garbage." Reporters circled the gates, shouting questions no one inside would answer. Lawyers filed emergency petitions. Civil rights groups stepped in, pointing to a pattern. Multiple inmates hospitalized from spoiled meals, and now one dead. Pressure mounted on the governor's office. Inside, the prison doubled down on control. Guards were ordered to serve meals faster, with less contact. Some trays arrived half empty, others ice cold. The men grew thinner, angrier, more desperate. Then came a spark no one expected. During a routine meal delivery, an inmate hurled his untouched loaf back through the slot. But instead of hitting the floor, it struck a guard in the throat, knocking him to the ground. Other inmates cheered, banging on their doors. The guard gasped for air, clutching his neck. This single act, one man's refusal to swallow another bite, ignited the darkest chapter yet in the dirty truth about the prison menu. Retaliation served cold. The guard's collapse was the breaking point for prison staff. Within hours, the administration authorized a full response. Cell by cell, tactical teams stormed through the blocks. Inmates were dragged out, shackled, and thrown face first on the floor. Shouts and screams echoed down the corridors as officers barked orders. "Hands behind your back! Don't move!" But the harshest punishment wasn't the beatings. It was the food. The next morning, every tray came with the same thing, a smaller, harder loaf. No sides, no drink, just a brick, dry and cracking at the edges. Inmates tried to eat, but the loaf was like concrete, impossible to chew, impossible to swallow. Some spat it out, some tossed it against the wall. The message was clear: eat this or starve. One inmate scribbled a note on toilet paper, smuggled out by a visitor. It read, "We are being starved alive." That note made its way to the press. And when it hit the headline, the public learned a chilling truth. Food wasn't just dirty. It was a weapon of torture. The outrage grew louder. The protests outside the gates swelled bigger. And then a federal investigation was announced, one that promised to uncover everything the prison had tried to hide. But before the investigators could finish, something happened inside that forced the world to pay attention again. The breaking point. The federal investigators had barely stepped through the gates when the prison erupted once more. It started in the chow hall. The men lined up, trays in hand, staring down at what was served. Another loaf, cold, cracked, reeking of grease. Some trays weren't even full bricks, just broken chunks tossed onto metal. One inmate shouted across the room, "They're starving us to death." Another slammed his tray onto the floor. The crash echoed, sparking a chain reaction. Trays flew, fists clenched, and the hall became a storm of chaos. Guards rushed in, shields raised, swinging batons. Pepper spray filled the air, making men choke and stumble. But this time, the inmates didn't back down. They flipped tables, broke chairs, and fought back with whatever they could grab. In the middle of the chaos, one prisoner climbed on top of the table and screamed at the investigators watching from behind a glass window. "Look at what they feed U.S." He held up a loaf, so moldy it was black and green, the stench spreading across the room. The investigators froze. Cameras rolled. The evidence was undeniable. The prison tried to cover it up, claiming it was a staged protest. But the footage leaked, and what happened next would drag the entire system into the spotlight like never before. The footage that couldn't be ignored. The leaked video hit the evening news like a bomb. Clips of inmates hurling trays, shouting, and waving moldy loaves filled TV screens across the country. Headlines blared. "Prison food unfit for animals," "Evidence of starvation inside state facility," and "Inmates riot over rotting meals." For the first time, the public could see it for themselves. Not just stories, not just rumors. Proof. The images were raw, undeniable, and horrifying. Lawmakers demanded hearings. Governors called emergency meetings. Civil rights groups declared the meals a violation of human rights. Even correctional officers' unions, embarrassed by the footage, distance themselves from the warden's policies. Inside the prison, inmates felt a surge of hope. Finally, the world was paying attention. But the staff saw it differently. To them, the leak was humiliation, proof that control had slipped away. The retaliation was swift. Entire cell blocks were stripped of privileges, no commissary, no visits, no phone calls. And once again, the punishment came on a tray. This time, the food wasn't just dirty, it was deadly. One evening, several inmates reported that the stew tasted strange, more bitter than usual. Hours later, dozens fell violently sick, vomiting and collapsing across their cells. The dirty truth about the menu had reached its darkest point yet. And the question was no longer just about hunger. It was about survival. Poison on the menu. The night the stew was served, the cell blocks turned into makeshift infirmaries. Men collapsed on concrete floors, clutching their stomachs, vomiting until they were too weak to move. Guards shouted for medical staff, but there weren't enough nurses to treat everyone. By dawn, stretchers rolled down the halls. Dozens of inmates were rushed to the prison hospital. A few never made it out alive. The official cause, food-borne illness. But inmates swore it was deliberate. Tainted food served as punishment. Whispers spread. They're trying to kill us. The fear was worse than the hunger now. Every tray slid under a cell door carried suspicion. Was it safe? Or was it the next step in silencing complaints? Outside, the news broke quickly. Families demanded an emergency federal review. Protesters gathered in larger numbers than ever, holding photos of their sick loved ones. For the first time, national politicians spoke up, calling the prison's menu a disgrace to human rights. But inside, the anger boiled over yet again. On one tier, when a guard shoved trays through the slots, inmates refused to touch them. Instead, they slid the trays back out, stacking them in the hallway like a barricade. And when the guard tried to clear it, one inmate made a move so bold, it would push the prison into its most violent confrontation yet. The tray barricade. The hallway outside the cells was lined with stacked trays, dirty, greasy, untouched. The smell of spoiled stew still hung heavy in the air. Guards marched down, shields raised, barking orders, "Clear it out!" But before they could, one inmate reached through a slot and hurled another tray straight at them. The metal clanged off a shield, splattering rotten food across their faces. That single act unleashed chaos. Guards surged forward, ramming shields against the cell doors, shouting curses. Inmates banged fists against steel, some hurling water, urine, and more trays through slots. The block shook with noise, rage, and defiance. One guard slipped on spilled stew and went down hard. In an instant, inmates shoved more trays out, pelting him until his team dragged him back. Radios screamed for backup. Sirens wailed. The tier became a battlefield. For the first time, even the guards hesitated. The sheer force of resistance, hundreds of inmates refusing food, refusing fear, shook the control they thought they had. But the retaliation that followed would be even worse than spoiled meat or moldy bread, because the warden was about to approve a punishment so extreme it would make headlines around the world. The extreme punishment. The warden was furious. Guards injured, footage leaking, headlines exploding. He saw the tray barricade not as protest, but as rebellion, and his solution was ruthless. A new order came down, nutritional control. It meant meals were reduced even further. No more hot food, no more variety. For weeks, inmates received nothing but the disciplinary loaf, water, and sometimes plain rice. The portions were so small men dropped weight fast, 10, 20, even 30 pounds. Faces grew hollow, eyes sunken. Some collapsed during roll call. Others whispered they could hear bones creak when they stood. One inmate wrote in a smuggled letter, "They're starving us into silence. We are disappearing." But instead of breaking them, the punishment lit a fire. Inmates began organizing in secret, tapping on pipes, passing notes, planning the only protest they had left, a hunger strike. Dozens refused every tray, pushing them back untouched. Days turned into a week. Guards tried to tempt them with better food, sandwiches, fruit, even rare cartons of milk. But most men stayed strong. Then one morning, A body was found slumped in a solitary cell, an inmate who hadn't eaten for 18 days. And that death would turn the prison's dirty food scandal into a national crisis. Hunger Strike Nation. The second inmate's death lit a fire across the country. News anchors described the prison as a slow-motion execution ground. Headlines screamed, "Star behind bars." Families held vigils outside the gates, candles flickering in the night. Inside, the hunger strike spread like wildfire. Hundreds of inmates pushed their trays back untouched. In some blocks, not a single man ate for days. The silence during mealtime was deafening. Only the sound of trays sliding back under doors. The prison scrambled to respond. Medical teams were ordered to monitor weight loss, but the reports were chilling. Men dropping 20, 30, even 40 pounds in weeks. Some could no longer walk without help. Officials tried intimidation. Guards banged on doors, shouting, "Eat or die, it's your choice." But the men stayed firm. They would rather starve than swallow poison. The protest reached Washington. Senators demanded hearings. Human rights groups flooded the courts with lawsuits, and federal investigators declared the food system a violation of basic decency. But even as cameras rolled and politicians argued, inside the prison reality was harsher than ever. In one block, a man collapsed during roll call, his body frail as paper. Guards carried him out on a stretcher while the rest of the inmates banged their fists in unison. A final act of defiance. The dirty truth about the prison menu was no longer hidden. It was out in the open. And what came next would decide not just the fate of the inmates, but the future of the entire prison system. Government steps in. The hunger strike couldn't be ignored. With deaths mounting and images of frail, starved inmates plastered across national news, the government finally stepped in. Federal marshals arrived at the gates. Investigators swarmed the kitchens, seizing records, hauling away trays as evidence. Health officials condemned the meals as unfit for human consumption. Lawsuits piled up against the prison and its food contractor. The warden was removed. Contracts were torn up. For the first time, inmates saw small changes. Hot meals, fresh fruit, cartons of milk that weren't sour. But for many, it was too little, too late. The scars of starvation, both physical and mental, would never leave. The message was clear. The dirty truth about the prison menu had finally reached the outside world.